High up in the Himalayas, thousands of meters above sea level, the Kingdom of Bhutan doesn't seem like the sort of place where great strategic games might play out. With a population under 800,000 and no formal diplomatic ties with any permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, the small nation has long had a reputation as a beautiful backwater, the sort of place that measures success not in GDP but in gross national happiness. But looks can be deceiving, because while Bhutan may seem insignificant, that's not how two major regional powers see it. For China and India, tiny Bhutan is not just a small kingdom occupying a slice of mountain landscape between them, it's also a strategic key, a place that could gift either capital a major advantage in any conflict. An advantage that Beijing is currently trying to leverage through an underreported land grab. Since 2015, structures have begun appearing in disputed territory between China and Bhutan. Homes, yeah, but also access roads, military outposts, helipads, and other pieces of infrastructure. The point seems to be to lay a Chinese claim to the lands before a commission can finalize the border. A claim that might just deal India a strategic blow in a region where Beijing and New Delhi's troops recently clashed. To explain what we mean, let's quickly back up and examine the issue at the heart of all of this, the disputed zones on the Chinese border. Along with India, Bhutan is one of only 2 countries out of 14 to have an officially disputed land border with China. But while India's claim is sprawling, covering thousands of kilometers and entire states like Arunachal Pradesh, Bhutan's is much smaller. According to Foreign Policy, it comprises, quote, 495 square kilometers of territory in north-central Bhutan, in the Jharkhand and Pasamlung valleys, and 269 square kilometers in the Doklam plateau in the west on Bhutan's border with India. To this, we can add a place called Sak Teng, which Beijing only started including in its claims in 2020. Bhutan, meanwhile, disputes a chunk of territory to its north. The basis for China's claims is that these regions were once part of Tibet and thus should now be a part of China, and Beijing has been trying to get a hold of them for quite some time. Boundary talks between the 2 countries first began way back in 1984. In 1996, they came close to cinching a deal that would see China abandon its claim on the northern regions in return for Doklam in the west, but the deal was ultimately sunk by India, and for pretty good reasons that we'll get to shortly. For now, we'll simply add that both Beijing and Thimphu agreed shortly after not to make any changes at the boundary until the disputes were sorted. An agreement that China is now refusing to abide by. Back in 2015, Beijing announced that it would settle a new village, Gailafo, in the disputed northern areas. Supposedly, this was part of an anti-poverty drive to move locals into better accommodation, but it pretty quickly blossomed into an orgy of construction. By 2021, journalists from Foreign Policy were reporting that alongside this single village had appeared over 100 kilometers of new roads, 5 military outposts, a comms base, a signals tower, and a hydro power plant. Since then, building has gotten even more frantic. In 2023 alone, Gailafag doubled in size, adding 150 more houses. To its west, the new village of Tamalong went from just 70 homes at the end of 2022 to 235 by the end of 2023. And this is just the start. The South China Morning Post reports that the 2 will grow to the size of towns in 2024. Throughout the region, other villages are starting to pop up, each accompanied by military and police structures. It's all part of a plan to plant what officials have called protective citadels along China's frontiers, or rather, that's what they're willing to admit publicly. Because some observers see a deeper strategy behind these Chinese land grabs in Bhutan's north. A strategy not to alter facts on the ground and gain control of valleys in the disputed Boyle-Kenpajong region, but to use them as leverage to get the region they originally wanted, Doklam. Situated in Bhutan's extreme west, the Doklam Plateau is close to the area where the borders of China, Bhutan, and India all meet. It's also an area where China has tried to build infrastructure before. In 2017, an attempt by Chinese soldiers to build a road from Tibet into Doklam and onto a ridge known as Jampheri resulted in a military standoff with India that lasted over 70 days. Although Beijing ultimately backed down, China has since built one of its new villages within the disputed area. But it has yet to try returning to the Jampheri Ridge, likely because it knows doing so would cause the mother of all diplomatic spats with India. That's because the ridge offers a direct view down onto the Siliguri corridor, a place also poetically known as the Chicken's Neck. If you've ever looked at a map of India, you've probably noticed that weird little outcrop in the country's east, where it curves up and around Bangladesh to incorporate a bunch of extra land. Well, the Siliguri Corridor is the thin strip connecting that eastern territory to the Indian mothership. A mere 22 kilometers wide in some places, it's the only land route open to the Indian Army if it needs to urgently get to the 7 northeastern states. That means any military on the Doklam plateau could gain fire control over one of India's most vulnerable points. And New Delhi is terrified this is exactly what China wants to do. Among the 7 northeastern states is Arunachal Pradesh, over which the two powers fought a bloody war in 1962. To this day, China claims it as southern Tibet. The fear among Indian war planners is that China's building spree in North Bhutan is a prelude to annexing Doklam in the west and gaining a significant military advantage. If you're wondering how this would work, you need to know that the northern region China is currently building on, the Bale region, is sacred to the Bhutanese. According to Foreign Policy, quote, Bhutan ceding the Bale region, an area of immense cultural and religious importance, is as likely as Britain giving up Stonehenge. The silent occupation is instead intended to force the hand of the Bhutanese leadership, making it more eager to discuss the future of Doklam. In other words, China knows Bhutan cares far more about Bale than it does about Doklam. It also knows it can't start building all over Doklam without risking a clash with India. The ideal outcome would therefore be for Bhutan to surrender its claim on Doklam to preserve its access to the sacred area of Bale and thus giving Beijing ownership of the Jamphiri Ridge. The only problem? Bhutan isn't only looking out for itself, it also cares deeply about what India thinks. Depending on how you look at things, Bhutan is either India's BFF or its former protectorate. Between 1949 and 2007, a treaty allowed New Delhi to dictate Bhutan's foreign policy in exchange for security guarantees. These days, Thimphu is allowed to chart its own course, but it still clings tightly to its biggest ally. About 70% of all imports come from India, and Bhutan's currency is pegged to the rupee. Until recently, this would have meant there was roughly zero chance that Bhutanese leaders would disregard India's wishes. After all, the country doesn't even have formal diplomatic ties with China, a unique case in Asia. But as Chinese pressure grows, more and more Bhutanese are starting to advocate for greater links with the superpower to their north. Hence why former Prime Minister Lotte Shering took care in 2023 to emphasize that China's new villages were not being built on Bhutanese soil, hence too why the nation signed a cooperation agreement last October to try and formally solve their boundary issues. There's even talk in some quarters about building a new road linking Bhutan with China, but even if that doesn't happen, some in India fear resolving the boundary disputes could lead to the two nations establishing formal diplomatic links. As a Chatham House report from late last year noted, quoting, Beijing will anticipate that a deal consolidating its gains in northern Bhutan may lead to formal diplomatic relations and the opportunity to draw Thimphu into its orbit. Even if it never leads to Bhutan surrendering its claim on Doklam, such an outcome would still be bad from New Delhi's perspective. Right now, many of India's neighbors are going through a period of flirtation with China. Some have taken massive loans from Beijing and fallen into debt. Others have signed what France 24 called muscular trade deals. The list is long. The Maldives elected a pro-China president in September. Bangladesh and Sri Lanka owe Beijing money, with Sri Lanka even allowing a Chinese research vessel, or more likely a spy ship, to dock in late 2023 against Indian wishes, although a similar ship was turned away in 2024. In Nepal, meanwhile, China seems to be actively meddling in the country's politics. Pakistan is a longtime Beijing ally. Over in the east, China is backing up some of Myanmar's rebels. That really leaves only Bhutan as a border state that isn't falling under Beijing's sway. Were Thimphu to start gravitating towards its northern neighbor, it would be a big geopolitical blow for India. It would also align with what we know about Chinese strategy in the region. According to the United States Institute of Peace, quoting, Beijing desires to keep New Delhi contained in a geostrategic South Asian box with the lid on tight. Chinese leaders perceive India as an oversized middle power with great power pretensions. Now, obviously, India has friends beyond its immediate borders. Alongside China, it's a founding member of the BRICS Club, which recently expanded to 9 members, as well as part of the Quad Alliance, also comprising the United States, Japan, and Australia. Still, by demonstrating that India's influence is waning in South Asia, China can continue to claim to be the leading Asian power. And if it can also gain territory in Doklam at the same time, so much the better. Although we did mention it earlier, Doklam doesn't just keep India's military planners up at night, but also China's. Right next to Doklam is the Chumbi Valley in Yadong County, which runs alongside the Indian state of Sikkim. In the event of a conflict, China fears that Indian forces in Sikkim and those stationed in Bhutan could conduct a pincer movement and cut the region off. Adding Doklam to its portfolio would not only make offensives against India easier, but also increase the defensibility of Tibet's far south. And this is important because China and India have a history of modern tensions going back to the 1940s. Aside from the War of 1962, there were tensions in 2017 and most recently clashes in 2020 that led to a small number of deaths. Given both lay claim to parts of one another's territory, these tensions are unlikely to ever truly fade. According to Crisis Group, quote, "To the west, China controls 38,000 square kilometers of territory that New Delhi also claims. To the east, India holds 90,000 square kilometers that Beijing says belongs to China." As a result, the fate of even a small slice of Bhutanese land can take on massive significance in the two capitals. If war ever does break out, both sides want to be sure they have the maximum advantage. Luckily, war breaking out between China and India does not look very likely at this point, or even in the medium term. As The Economist notes, China and India both seem keen to stabilize their border dispute. Since the deadly clash in 2020, they have pulled back troops from several flashpoints, creating buffer zones where neither side patrols. At the same time, the two governments maintain cordial relations in a number of forums, not just the BRICS, but also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Still, the Chinese land grabs and strange political games currently playing out under the clear mountain skies of Bhutan are worth paying attention to because of what they show us about the world. About how we seem to be returning to an era of politics closer to that of the 19th century, a multipolar world in which several big powers are always jostling for supremacy, trying to gain an edge with one eye on a possible future war, even in times of peace. The fate of a Himalayan plateau may seem like small potatoes today, but it may one day turn out to be the difference for Beijing or for New Delhi between defeat and victory. And now in our next story today, we're going to turn to the Caribbean nation of Haiti, where violent armed gangs rule the country with near impunity as an international intervention struggles to get off the ground. Now, despite hopes that the nation of Kenya might lead a multinational peacekeeping force into Haiti's streets, the Kenyan government has proven thus far unable to get past its own high court, let alone actually get to Haiti. Now look, we've already covered the crisis in Haiti at length in prior episodes, but we'll give you just a brief bit of context here, just in case you're tuning in for the first time, in which case, welcome. Haiti has seen an incredible increase in gang violence during 2023 and 2024, so much so that Haitian government, police, and armed forces have been overwhelmed. Now the gangs rule most of the Haitian capital of Port-au-Prince, and the government is all but non-existent in the countryside. Because of Haiti's long legacy of failed and destructive attempts at intervention by major Western powers, it's the African nation of Kenya that has volunteered to step up and lead a force to rein in the violence. In November of 2023, the Kenyan parliament had agreed on a motion to deploy 1,000 police officers at the head of a force unifying police and military from several other countries. But that motion was blocked by a judge from Kenya's highest court on the grounds that it was unconstitutional for Kenyan police to be deployed internationally, and since then the intervention has been stalled indefinitely. There are a number of important updates around the Kenyan intervention this week, but unfortunately, we've got to start off with the bad news. Specifically, Kenya has been unable to budge. Despite vows by Kenya's President William Ruto that the legal ruling wouldn't stand in the way of the deployment, he's been unable to move the needle in any substantive way. The issue at hand is Kenya's lack of what its high court describes as, quote, reciprocal agreements with Haiti, basically a formal arrangement with Haiti where the beleaguered government asks for Kenya's help and Kenya agrees. But although Haitian officials have been seeking help since 2022 and have showed no opposition to the idea of Kenya coming in, the paperwork is still conspicuously absent. Ruto claims that it was sent several months ago, but whatever documents he's been able to procure for Kenya's high court appear not to be enough. The trouble is, if Kenya can't get involved as the leader of the proposed intervention, then all the other nations who'd likely take part are basically forced to wait until Kenya either gets its situation figured out or steps aside so that the plan can be rewritten essentially from scratch. And while these other nations would certainly like to see Kenya get its internal roadblock cleared away, there's very little appetite to throw out the existing plan because, as it turns out, the international community actually rather likes it. Although he can't deploy troops, Kenyan President Ruto has been hard at work continuing to facilitate the plan on the assumption that it'll ultimately go forward. Between the recent UN summit among G20 nations in Rio de Janeiro and the even more recent summit of the Caribbean Community of Nations, or CARICOM, in Guyana, good news has been pouring in around what the intervention might ultimately look like. The US has already pledged $200 million in logistical support equipment and direct funding, and they've been backed with another $60 million from Canada. The US has also promised to rein in international arms smuggling on account of just how many of Haiti's firearms seem to be coming from America. France has also pledged its own substantial sums and has urged other French-speaking nations to consider the same. The African nation of Benin stated that it would provide 2,000 additional troops in support of Kenya, effectively tripling the force's size. Guyana and Jamaica have pledged money, and Burundi, Chad, Senegal, the Bahamas, Jamaica, and Belize have each confirmed they'll be sending their own soldiers or police to boost the operation even further. As the planned intervention becomes more and more multinational in its structure, it shows increased potential to be a test case for a new sort of foreign deployment, one that doesn't rely on the same few nations to be global policemen, but actively solicits buy-in and participation from nations that are situated close to an affected area or who share cultural or historic ties that go simply beyond calling on whatever superpower is closest. With the US and other NATO members offering funds and logistical support, the hope is that a multinational force like this may end up being more effective. And in fact, Kenya's internal delays may lend themselves directly to a broader and larger foreign response as other nations throw their support behind the intervention in hopes of piling on pressure and eventually relieving the political blockage. Granted, that means that if the intervention ultimately goes sideways, more nations will come out with egg on their face. But nonetheless, Haiti is quickly turning into a global experiment on more effective interventions, or it would if the intervention could finally move forward. Now, moving on from Kenya, it's important to understand that the roadblocks to the Haiti mission come from multiple vectors. At the Caribbean Community, or CARICOM, something we mentioned earlier, Haiti's own acting president and acting prime minister, Ariel Henry, has been the one catching flack, not William Ruto. Henry's been a controversial figure in Haiti for some time after he assumed his acting powers immediately in the wake of the assassination of Kenya's last president, Jovenel Moise. Henry is widely suspected of having been involved with planning the assassination, which itself set off a cascade of events that led Haiti to its current gang violence crisis. But now the bulk of Haiti's remaining political opposition is increasingly treating Henry as an illegitimate leader who's overstayed his welcome. For the international intervention, that poses two problems. First, there's Henry's own underwhelming work during the effort to bring in the international coalition, doing a lot less than he probably could be doing to clear out red tape and internal political barriers. Second, and much more important, is the risk that a full-scale intervention would be received by the Haitian public as an act intended to prop up a highly unpopular and potentially illegitimate leader, not to mention the hard reality that that could be exactly what ends up happening if Henry is able to play the situation to his advantage. At CARICOM, Prime Minister of the Caribbean nation of Antigua and Barbuda, Gaston Brown, became the first to call for Henry to step down. Said Brown, "At the end of the day, he barely has legitimacy, and we have to be careful that perception is not seen as the reality of the Haitian people, which could only serve to inflame the tension." Several other leaders at CARICOM confirmed that they perceive Henry to be the major barrier to the intervention's forward progress at this point, largely owing to the sheer force of the political opposition against him. What the international community is going to do about Henry, or what they even can do, well, that's another question entirely. If there's one thing that basically the entire nation of Haiti agrees on right now, including its own civilian population, its gangs, and its political opposition, is that Henry needs to go. Having him around at the end of a foreign intervention seems to be a fantastic way to ensure that the intervention would go down as a failure. But what a political solution would look like without Henry is just as difficult to assess. Haiti's political scene has always been fractured, and now, with alliances and interests changing rapidly in the face of the gang violence, there's been little internal or international monitoring within Haiti's political elite to figure out just who's involved with what shady business. For his part, Henry himself has called for unity and written off the opposition's calls for him to be removed as a pure power grab. But even if it is, the writing's on the wall anyway. A continued Ariel Henry administration cannot be the international intervention's final outcome, if and when it eventually does resolve Haiti's situation. And in one final piece of Haiti news, the list of who might finally replace Henry as the head of the nation has just gotten a good bit shorter. Last week, a judge investigating the 2021 assassination of Jovenel Moise unveiled charges against 50 people accused of being complicit with the killing, including ex-Prime Minister Claude Joseph and Moise's own widow, Martine. According to the judge, the assassination plot intended to replace Jovenel Moise with his wife. While the plot has obviously failed, it's the new indictments that are more likely to keep all the players involved out of running for the eventual secession of Haiti. With Henry refusing to hold elections and many of Haiti's gang leaders now practically as prominent in national affairs as its highest politicians, the Kenya-led intervention will have its work cut out for it when the time comes to restore order. And our final story today, let's talk about Sweden finally joining NATO. In the early hours of February the 24th, 2022, President Vladimir Putin sat in a wood-paneled room to give a speech that would change history. Announcing the special military operation in Ukraine, the autocrat described in rambling terms how he had been pushed to take these measures. Not just out of concern for Russian speakers in the Donbass, but because of what he viewed as Western expansionism, specifically the way the NATO alliance was pushing ever eastward. In fact, criticism of NATO turned out to be the speech's centerpiece. Roughly 1,300 words were dedicated to a litany of grievances against the military alliance, all of which makes the events of last week so deliciously ironic. After launching Europe's most destructive land war since 1945 with the express goal of stopping NATO expansion, Putin was forced to watch as the alliance did exactly that. On Monday, February 26th, Hungary's parliament became the last vote in favor of Sweden becoming NATO's 32nd member. With that, a 2-year process came to an end, a process which will forever reshape the geopolitics of Europe. To understand how big of a deal Sweden's accession is, we need only look at the Nordic nations' history. Since the end of the Napoleon era, Sweden has been militarily non-aligned, neutral in both of the European murder-suicide pacts that we call the two world wars, not part of any bloc in the subsequent Cold War. During those 200 years, foreign policy reports that its army rarely strayed beyond its borders, only doing so in small deployments as part of international forces in places like Lebanon or Afghanistan. As recently as 2021, then Defense Minister Peter Hultqvist was guaranteeing that Stockholm would never join NATO. Public polling backed his position. Only a third of Swedes wanted to seek protection beneath the alliance's nuclear umbrella. Most were content to simply keep charting the non-aligned course that had served them so well over the centuries. But all that changed after Putin finished speaking in the early hours of February the 24th, 2022. Mere moments later, missiles began to slam into Ukrainian cities. Russian armor surged across the border, and a new era in European history began, one in which an aggressive Moscow now threatened all its neighbors. As director of studies at the Swedish Defense Research Agency, Robert Dahlstjö sadly told the New York Times, "We had our dream, and now it's time to wake up." In Sweden's case, that meant waking up to the fact that the country was no longer capable of fighting a major war. Despite still fielding top-of-the-range kit and boasting a powerful defense industrial base, Sweden in 2022 was no longer the military power it had been during the Cold War. From a reserve force of 850,000 men in 1990, Stockholm could now only call 10,000. The Navy and Air Force was 70% smaller, with the latter having given away about 2,000 fighter jets. Were a warmongering Kremlin to set its sights on Sweden, it was clear the land of Volvo and IKEA would just not stand a chance. And so it was that on May the 18th, 2022, Sweden and Finland entered a joint bid to join NATO, a huge step for two historically non-aligned nations. As the BBC wrote, Putin sent his army into Ukraine in 2022 in the expectation it would check NATO's expansion and weaken Western collectivism. In fact, with the addition of Sweden and Finland, the opposite has happened. Only things wouldn't go quite that smoothly. Although Helsinki became a full member of NATO in a record 11 months, Stockholm would be forced to spend nearly 2 years in the waiting room. The reason? Objections from NATO members. As a vast military alliance in which all states are expected to aid one another in the event of war, NATO works on the basis of unanimity. That meant 31 separate capitals with their own calculations and domestic political issues needed to sign off on Sweden joining. 28 said yes almost immediately, a number that jumped to 29 when Finland joined and was like, well, yeah, obviously. But not everyone was on board. In NATO's east and south, 2 capitals decided to hold out. 2 capitals hoping to leverage something against their allies. Capitals known as Ankara and Budapest. The reasons why Turkey wasn't willing to ratify Sweden's membership were pretty straightforward. As a country that houses a large Kurdish population, Sweden had long been in the sights of President Erdogan, who claimed Stockholm was harboring militants from the outlawed PKK. Before dropping his veto, Erdogan demanded a tightening of laws, a demand Sweden eventually obliged. Although that led to Erdogan sending the bill to Turkey's parliament last summer, a vote was derailed by a spate of Quran burnings in Sweden. It wasn't until the backlash had died down this January that Ankara pushed ahead with ratifying Stockholm's membership. It also probably didn't hurt that America had blocked Turkey's government from buying F-16 fighter jets until Sweden was admitted. As NPR notes in the aftermath, the State Department said it would allow the sale of some $23 billion worth of fighter jets and equipment to Turkey. Hungary's veto, though, was an altogether stranger affair. Initially, Budapest claimed it was just busy with other stuff and would ratify Sweden's accession soon. Prime Minister Viktor Orban even swore that Hungary wouldn't be the last country to give approval. But then things started getting personal. Last year saw Budapest repeatedly attack Stockholm for criticizing Hungary's democratic backsliding. When the NATO issue was brought up, former Presidents Kártal and Novak explicitly linked the two, declaring, "Sweden is or has been quite vocal in condemning the functioning of our parliament or stated a lack of democracy in our country." For some in Europe, Budapest stalling over Sweden, coming as it did around the same time the country was holding up an EU aid package to Ukraine, confirmed their worst fears about Orban, that the Hungarian leader might secretly be doing Putin's bidding. But diplomats privately briefed that it was more likely that Orban was just trying to build ties with Erdogan, showing the Turks that they could count on Hungary to stand by them. As one anonymous official told Politico, when it comes to NATO's accession, Hungary's position is fundamentally shaped by the preferences of Turkey. Still, it would only be a month after Ankara dropped its veto that Budapest likewise stood aside. By that time, Orban had been under intense pressure, both from the EU and NATO, for wielding his veto over multiple Ukraine-related issues. Along with the stick of pissing off all of his allies, Orban was also offered the carrot of 4 Gripen fighter jets. Wisely, he took the deal. All of which is how the Hungarian parliament came, on Monday the 26th of February 2024, to clear the way for Sweden's accession. After centuries of non-alignment, Stockholm will now become NATO's 32nd member. It's a role that will bring with it challenges, but also opportunities. Opportunities for NATO to reshape the security architecture, not just of Northern Europe, but also of the Arctic. Opportunities that could prove crucial in the case of all-out war with Russia. The biggest of these, the final transformation of the Baltic Sea into a NATO lake. Right up until the moment Finland joined the alliance in 2023, one of NATO's biggest weaknesses was the short land border connecting Poland to the Baltic states. With the Russian client state of Belarus on one side and the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad on the other, it was all too easy to see how a lightning assault could cut Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia off from the rest of NATO. Finland's joining changed the calculus, allowing for the resupply of the Baltics by sea. Sweden also joining changes the calculus all over again, weighing things heavily in NATO's favor. With the strategic Swedish island of Gotland now under NATO's umbrella, resupplying the Baltics via sea looks remarkably easy. At the same time, it gives the alliance the ability to bottle up Russia's Baltic Sea fleet and deny vessels passage out of Kaliningrad. As foreign policy put it, everything in Kaliningrad and St. Petersburg will now be in range of NATO missiles. Gotland also gives Sweden and NATO an opportunity to build out a logistical hub or block the Russian Navy's attempts to harass Western shipping lanes. Nor is it just the Baltic capitals that will be breathing easier with Sweden in the club. Should Moscow attack Finland or Norway's far north, Sweden would become an essential land transit route for reinforcing both. Speaking of the frozen north, perhaps the second most important aspect of Sweden's membership is the way it allows NATO to up its game in the Arctic. There are only 8 Arctic nations in the world: Canada, the USA, Denmark, thanks to Greenland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. Because Russia is so big, it controls a majority of the region's coastline, slightly over 50%. That's a major issue in an era of warming seas, when control of Arctic waters may be the next big battleground. With the 7 other Arctic nations now all in NATO, it becomes easier for the alliance to counter threats there, but also from China, which has announced its intention to open a polar Silk Road. However, only highlighting its geographical assets does a disservice to Sweden. As we covered in a separate video released back in June of this year, the Swedish military, while not large, is extremely technologically adept. In the air, the domestically produced Gripen fighter jet is considered a world-class machine. At sea, the stealthy Gotland-class attack submarines are famous for once managing to score a direct hit on the aircraft carrier USS Ronald Reagan during a mock battle. In terms of its defense industrial base too, Sweden is a serious player. Per capita, it's one of the world's largest arms manufacturers and a major arms exporter. Local companies like Volvo and Ericsson build military kit. As Defense Minister Paul Johnson proudly told Foreign Policy, there is no other country of 10 million that can produce submarines, fighter aircraft, surface combatants, infantry fighting vehicles, and very advanced artillery systems. Given the difficulties Europe has had in scaling up its defense industry to support Ukraine, adding a leading arms manufacturer to NATO is no minor thing, especially when that country is also at the forefront of offensive cyber capabilities, something many Western nations lack. Yet for all the obvious advantages Sweden's accession now brings NATO, we shouldn't pretend everything is sunshine and unicorn farting rainbows. If anything, the long, torturous process to admit Stockholm has shown the alliance may be more brittle than it looks. For NATO's collective defense clause to deter adversaries, there needs to be a credible threat that anyone screwing with, say, tiny little Estonia will then have to deal with 31 other nations turning their guns on them. 31 nations that include true military powers like the USA, UK, France, and Turkey. The procrastination of Turkey and Hungary in admitting Sweden, though, suggests that the alliance may not be as unified as it would like its enemies to believe, that there exists cracks that can be exploited, that could be used to drive its members apart. That could, in a worst-case scenario, see some members ignore their duty to protect the others. To be clear, there's currently no suggestion that Ankara or Budapest is preparing to walk away from NATO, nor are we likely to see their commitment tested on the battlefield in the near future. But Sweden's long journey into the alliance, at the very least, shows some capitals are willing to use their vetoes as leverage to exact concessions from the others. For Vladimir Putin, ruminating on how his war to stop NATO expansion backfired so spectacularly, that might qualify as a silver lining, a sign that for all its growing reach, the North Atlantic Alliance may not be quite as united as it thinks. Hopefully, it's a unity that'll never have to be tested. And that's where we end this week's episode of The Situation Room. Thank you for watching.